I want to talk to you about the voices that you may hear in your head. A lot of times we may have thoughts that come into our mind at any given moment, and we may wonder, where did that come from? And why am I thinking about these things? It may seem completely random. And there's a tendency for us to think, wow, I'm just an idiot. I can't control these thoughts. They just seem to come in, and I don't know why they come in. And the truth is, not every voice in your head is actually your voice. When spirit speaks to spirit, it always sounds like our voice, but there are actually three voices in our head at any given time: God's voice, the enemy's voice, or you can call him Satan's voice, and our voice. And if we can't distinguish between these three voices, we may think that it's ours. But once we can distinguish between the voices, we can recognize that I'm not stupid, and I have an enemy who may be trying to plant voices in my mind, can begin to get me into thought spins. And these thought spins can create emotions that cause this voice or this thought to gather some teeth, to get more strength. So it's important for us to notice the voice rather than give it our attention, because once we give it our attention, it can pull us in. How do we recognize the three voices and distinguish them? It's not as hard as you might think. And it requires us to notice a few key things. Let's talk first about God's voice. A few key features of God's voice. One thing about God's voice is that it is always very neutral. It's always very calm. It's generally the first voice that we may recognize. One thing that's very distinctive about God's voice is that it is a voice of awareness in our heart, as much or more than it is a voice in our head. God tells us that he speaks in both the mind and to the heart. His words, awareness of light, is what we generally first notice in our hearts. The heart is an organ of awareness. And that light gels into a thought in our mind. If we notice that the enemy cannot counterfeit that, he cannot speak light and peace to your heart. He can only focus on the mind. So it becomes much easier to begin to distinguish God's voice, but it does require that we soften our hearts, that we open our hearts, and that we release expectations and preconceived notions of what we think is right, and that we become open and humble to God's voice. Another distinctive feature about God's voice is that it is outwardly focused. It causes us to see clearly both ourselves and God and others. And another distinctive feature of his voice is that it lifts us. It accepts us. This is a voice of acceptance and love, unconditional love. We are accepted by God right where we are. But he loves us too much to leave us here. So you may notice that when you feel God's voice and hear his voice, that you feel this lift, this desire to be better. His voice is the voice of guilt and of godly sorrow, because guilt is focused on behavior. It doesn't attack our identity. Your identity is the same. It has not been damaged by your behaviors. You are still a child of God. But sometimes we veer off course, and the voice of guilt can help us to get back on course. So that leads us to the enemy's voice, Satan's voice. How do we recognize his voice? Well, he will try to speak to the mind. Now, you may wonder, how might he do that? He can whisper thoughts. I'll give you an example of how this can happen. I don't want you to think about the Statue of Liberty right now. What did you just think about? The very thing I asked you not to think about. So Satan may plant in our mind, oh, don't be thinking about those things. Those aren't right. Knowing full well that when he does that, we begin to think of that very thing. Now, we don't have to think that. We can notice that the thought is in our head and decide not to give it our attention. It's when we turn towards it that it becomes the voice we choose to follow. These voices, like voices in a room, and I might be talking to one person in front of me and giving them my attention, and there may be 50 other voices trying to get in. I might notice the voices, but I'm not necessarily giving them any attention. Satan may use something that he speaks to your mind, but you'll notice that when you try to plant it into your heart, it never turns into light. It never turns into a good seed. We can test each thought by going, is this a good seed? I might try to plant it at the level of my heart. And I'll find that it turns into fear or shame or anger or some other negative emotion. It never turns into light. Another distinctive feature of Satan's voice is it's always pushing us downward into shame. It's a voice that says, you're not good enough, you're not enough, or there isn't enough. There's some kind of lack, and you might as well just give up. If you notice, the first temptation that Adam and Eve experienced in the garden was of shame. Not the first temptation. The second temptation was shame. The first was to partake of the fruit. The second was, hey, you're naked. Quick, hide. And it was the temptation to hide from their identity at that point. So you'll notice that Satan will try to use things like, hey, you are stupid. You are not enough. You are not consistent. You are slow. The I ams, notice those. He attacks your identity. Another one that's a very good one that I've seen a lot is, if you're this, then prove it by your actions. And until you prove it with your actions, then you're not that. And it gets us caught in this feeling of, I have to do something consistently and show it before I can prove that I am that. So these are some of the distinctive features of God's voice and Satan's voice. Now, you're probably wondering, where is my voice in all of this? Your voice is the choosing voice, the agent voice, because neither God nor Satan can control you. You have to decide which voice you're going to listen to. So yours is the choosing voice. Which do I choose to listen to? The voice of light and love, or a voice of darkness and shame? It's also the planning voice. When you hear inspiration and you may go, wow, how could I implement that in my life? And we begin to put plans together and think into ways to implement things. And we essentially become a co-creator at that moment. And likewise, we may choose to hearken to a voice that says, hey, you're not enough, you might as well give up. And then we plan how we're just going to check out for the rest of the day because there's no point in even trying anymore. But ours is that hearkening, planning, choosing voice. It's important that you recognize these three voices in your head, because if you don't, you might find yourself hearkening to a voice that is seeking to limit you, that's seeking to push you down. And I encourage you to start noticing them rather than automatically giving them your attention. Notice the voice. Ask yourself, whose voice is this? Do I want to give this my attention right now? When we can notice and name the voice, we can have power over it and not have it automatically be running in our head. I hope this is helpful for you to distinguish between the three voices that you may hear in your head.